Um, is everyone here? I think we can start now. So I'm Swapnil. I'll be moderating the panel on market equilibrium. There's esteemed guests with us. Maybe we can start with introductions, like around the table.
Hi, my name is Alex Watts. I'm the co-founder and CEO of FastLane Labs, which is a smart contract-based sequencer for apps and validators.
I'm Josh Bowen. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Astria. We're building a shared sequencer on Celestia.
I'm Nathan. I'm a Discord chick poster, but I've also been a searcher, solver, builder, relay operator, and now I'm working on prediction markets.
I'm Mallesh. I'm a researcher at Consensys and also a professor of economics at Rice University.
Cool. Okay. So people who should know what's happening in the market, hopefully. Right. The topic of the panel is market equilibrium. So maybe start easy with it. What do you think where do you think Ethereum is right now in its state of the market? Is it at equilibrium? Some initial thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's fundamentally broken at the moment, but it's highly entropic. So we don't have a very good market structure, but like it's sort of like constantly changing. There's a lot of innovation that's happening. I think we had quite a sort of like stable place pre-merge when like there was like one centralizing vector, which was like all the order flow sort of going to flashbots. And we'll make a little tweak to sort of like address this like vector of centralization. We've just blown up the complexity of the market. There's all these competing incentives at play. There's all these people like trying to centralize power in their little like areas of the market. So it's very broken at the moment, but yeah, I think we're going into this later, but I'm still optimistic about where we're at.
Okay. Does anyone else want to have a...
To be honest, I'm not even sure that a state of equilibrium can be reached while we still have a single proposer. I think that right now, especially with private order flow and with the trend towards more and more of the total order flow becoming private, we're running into a scenario where each builder is able to externalize more and more value for themselves based on this private order flow. That's value that's not going to validators, not necessarily even back to the users. And I don't see that that's sustainable, especially since it's increasing.
Yeah, I'll just add that it's not, I mean, I agree with them, I agree with everything that was said, but also it's not just that it's not just that it's entropic. Everyone's trying to fix it by, yeah, I'm going to add my own little auction, I'm going to add one more thing on top. And no one's thinking about like top to bottom what that means. So like we're going to strap on precons and we're going to strap on intents and we're going to strap on, what's that other thing, base sequencing. Markets don't fix everything. You can't just have an auction and say, oh yeah, that's going to get us efficiency. Like it sounds very good in theory, but if you don't think about like adverse selection, if you don't think about all of that, it's not going to work.
All right, but what about two auctions?
just have a pile of auctions and keep stirring them until it looks right.
Just one more mechanism, bro. Just one more mechanism.
I think like what we're seeing is like every part of the stack is competing for like collecting like a larger percent of the revenue, the profit, whatever you want to call it. And it's like, okay, you have like order flow, and so you're trying to collect order flow, but like everyone that's like buying order flow is also like, oh, I'll just go make a front end and then I won't have to buy the order flow. I'll get the order flow from like having my own users, but the apps on the back end are also like, oh, if I like have my application change in a way that like I have essentially like isolated block space, then I will force people to like want to use my app, have to go through my order flow thing. So there's a lot of kind of like selfish, I guess I would like selfish market pressures that trend towards people wanting to fragment things, and there's not a lot of coordination between these parties because they're all relatively clearly like competitive with each other.
I think, yeah, that's true. But also I think like selfishness is something that we should embrace, because selfishness is like the most reliable force of the universe. You can always count on people to be selfish. And blockchain is about designing systems that coordinate this selfishness to achieve some kind of socially optimal outcome. So in the ideal system, selfishness should be like maximally rewarded. We shouldn't have systems where it's like you're a little bit selfish and that's good, but if you're like too selfish, that's bad, we'll like get you arrested or whatever. We should have systems like it's aligning maximum selfishness.
Well, one of the interesting things to piggyback off of that, Nathan, is that at a certain point, when you have all of these middlemen, all of these different actors inside of the space that are taking away value, at a certain point, these order flow auctions, this private order flow, stops being incentive compatible for the validators themselves, because if they're selfish, then there becomes a point where the value of the order flow that's leaked away by the builders and by proposer-builder separation and by the commit reveal mechanism starts to exceed the value of having these optimized by professional builders, like the optimal value from these blocks. And at a certain point, we'll hit this tipping point where all of a sudden the selfish move for validators, since they do have the proposer monopoly, may be to remove themselves from PBS and start really leaning into value capture for the 12 seconds, currently anyway, of monopoly time that they have.
So how do we maximize the utility of selfishness?
I'm actually not sure. I think this might be a thing where the equilibrium might just be constantly oscillating.
I think there is like I guess maybe it's like a further question, but I think that there is like an equilibrium where you sort of like maximize the value of selfishness, and that's when you like take away all of the barriers to entry and take away the like distinguish the different edges from each other. And a lot of the problems at the moment just come from like different sort of edges that like wrap together, and that's like creating these barriers to entry. And if you isolate these effectively, you can like maximize the utility of everyone being selfish in each individual category.
Yeah, and I think that's sort of the key point, that right now we talk about the proposer monopoly, and I know we're being funded by our lovely builder friends here, but really it's almost impossible for a new builder to break in, right? There's 3 builders, and they have 90-something% of block flow, and for them, every other little edge that they get goes on top of their already edges. So if you're an outsider trying to break in, you just have to be, pot committed with like $100 million or something like that to break in.
Or, alternatively, if I may, you can wait until all of the builders get cut out, because at a certain point, these builders are able to take value out of the system, right? And at a certain point, validators might start thinking, hey, if I don't participate in PBS, if I don't let these builders internalize this value from the order flow, then that means I can get all of the order flow by abusing my monopoly, and I can run auctions and I can capture all this value myself.
But they're already getting so much from...
Not all of it, though.
But like, what I guess like a couple questions would be like, Stefan's like kind of hand raised, he wants to interject. But like, what percent would we say of MEV tips or whatever is going back to the proposers? My understanding, somewhat naively, is like it's a relatively high percent of like the overall market, and there's a question of like, you coming from like a Polygon space, right? Like a relatively larger, like, or smaller validator set, right? There's a question of like, what are the trade-offs if we say all the validators have to choose to try to capture that value by, I'll say, vertically integrating their own functionality to do that? What's the break-even point, right? Like, how large does a validator need to be from, whether it's stake or organization or whatever, for it to be worthwhile to not sell it off? And it's a question of like economic incentivization. And to your point on kind of builder, I'm curious for like, the rest of the panelists and whatever, like, what do we think is like the blocking, like the primary blocking thing towards like a new builder entering the market? My assumption is it's not purely capital, and in like a competitive system, if it's literally raw capital, I would assume if someone says, hey, I think I can be, number 4 builder, I can get 10% of the blocks, I just need $50 million. My take on the venture space is that is not that hard to do. There's a little more of like a social aspect of like, where are you actually buying the order flow? It's not purely capital.
Capital is definitely like one of the edges. I think as like a solver, searcher, builder, whatever you want to call it, I sort of see it as like the same activity. The edges is like capital, it's information, it's engineering, it's order flow, and it's like alpha. And these kind of things are like sort of all mixed together, and you have like a centralizing vector whenever this is mixed together. If a builder brings order flow, it's like centralizing. If a market maker brings capital, it's like centralizing. Even if they bring information, it's centralizing. The ideal system is to like separate these concerns as much as possible and actually treat the quant as a first-class citizen. The quant is actually the person, like apart from the user and the proposer, like providing the most value in this system. But we have a world now where quants are actually like running very simple algorithms, and they're just executing on these other edges that they have. And it's a less efficient market than if we treated them as a first-class citizen and we sort of like took all of the other edges away.
Okay, that was like my next 8 questions answered already. Maybe something maybe off the chart. You suggested like someone needs to take a holistic look at the whole ecosystem. You said we should be selfish, and you were like referring to like multi-proposer. Like, what does the combination of this look like? Are these incentive games also incompatible with each other, or are they still compatible? Like, if we put all 4 of you in a room, say, like, you guys have autonomy on how a team goes, will you come up with a design that works, or do you break it even more?
I'd say there's like there's 3 people that are important. There's the user, there's the proposer, and there's like the quant, the person who can solve a complex optimization problem. They're the first-class citizens in the system. Everything else is just like infrastructure and piping, essentially. They should be the ones where the value is kind of conglomerating around. Everything else is just piping and shouldn't be so value extractive. And I think this is a relatively stable equilibrium as well, if you can like provide the right system to sort of like commoditize everything else.
I'm gonna agree with 2/3 of you, and I'm going to disagree with the fact that the proposer should be a first-class citizen in this. Like, I think it's part of the design that sort of says, okay, at the end of the day, nothing gets onto the block without the proposer signing on it. But if you think of what is the value add, and this might be an unpopular opinion if there are solo stakers in the room, what is the actual economic value add that they're doing relative to what the builder is doing? Or, oh, wow. I'm not sure, like, and they're already getting paid, right? All of these MEV tips are like, somebody did the analysis and it's off the order of 10 or 15% of what they're already getting paid for their consensus payments. So we're like skewing for this extra 10 or 15%, we're like really making messy market structure design. I'm not saying that, you need a centralized body to come in and say, this is the market we are going to run. We did that once and it's, the outcomes are mixed, but we do need to start thinking about who deserves that money. And it's not clear to me that this part of them, they do a lot of good work for us, to validators like that, but yeah.
But I mean, this is all like related to like, Ethereum overpaying for security, right? Like, what should it cost to like run the validators? Well, okay, how many nodes do you actually want to have? How does that relate to like your actual like validator count, as in like 32 ETH? What does it actually cost to run like a validator? And like, should we be making it cheaper to run a validator? Should we have fewer validators? What is the dollar cost of, this much bandwidth, this much compute, this much storage over state growth? And, are we seeing a thing where we say, actually, if we drop the 32 ETH limit to like a much lower number, then it's much more kind of capital efficient for like new validators to come in, and that allows you to kind of push down very aggressively on what you pay to validators. And if a bunch of them throw up their hand and say, oh, it's not worth it to do it, it's like, oh, well, if you got like, $3,000, you can show up and be a validator. So there's always a liquid supply of validators. And is that like where we should be pulling slack out of the system? And then, who are we redistributing that to? Are we distributing it to the quants? Are we distributing it to the users? And I have a question for you, Nathan, like, what do the quants look like? Like in the current system, like who are like the quants, right? Is it like the searcher builder? Is it like the aggregated that, do relays continue to exist in the system? Do we want to push relays out?
In the current system, the quant is like very simple. It's like not sophisticated at all. It's like someone who's just like, I'm going to run like a simple sort of arbitrage like curve or whatever. That's the essence of the quant work, and everything else is just like execution. But in a more efficient market, quants would be doing work on like predictions about the future of prices, and then we could have a more efficient market for price discovery. So it's like there's like all this sort of inefficiency that's like missing from the system right now. And you made a comment about we don't need a centralized sort of like force to come in and like enact changes. But I think that there's actually big improvements and big benefits that you can get just from like marginal progress along the way. So like we don't actually have to fix everything, but just making like 1%, 2%, 3% change in the right direction is like going to deliver a lot of value to retail users.
One of the like interesting things to think about is there's, to Malesh's point, there's who should the value accrue to, but then there's also the huge amount of path dependency that Ethereum has on the current structure and the current players. And it's not clear to me that all of the validators who are currently controlling the Ethereum network are going to want to, opt in. And I think this is really where the strength of the social layer comes into play.
Yeah, I agree with that. Like a lot of it is path dependence, and a lot of the design solutions you're seeing are sort of retconned in from path dependence rather than here is what de novo looks like a good design. Yeah. And the other thing is, I mean, how much should quant be paid? Like in any other market, like quants earn their own keep, and they'll earn their own keep if we give them a decent shot at it. Right now, the only way to be, or the easiest way to be a functional quant is to have your own builder, which is sort of a tricky, centralizing thing, because once you have a builder too, then you have an edge for private order flow. You have an edge for a lot of other things. So
it feels very unfair, right? Like I feel like you'd probably make a good quant, but like you just have these other edges that you'd have to get first.
I just don't look at my trading.
but that really is the thing, is that like to Nathan's point, a lot of the like, quants are not really put to their full potential, because right now, and it's my opinion that the majority of the competition is happening along the order flow vector, which is fundamentally a relationship game. But this is also a game that allows for value extraction from the system that proposers aren't receiving. And I think, like, as we've all seen, I think Block Native had a post on this last week, the amount of private order flow is increasing. It was at 15% this time last year, now it's at 30%. And as that number keeps going up, that means more and more value is going to go to, Nathan used the term quants, but I would argue that's not the quants value. I would argue that's the, BD people's value.
Yeah, I guess there's a very broken market structure where builders are bringing the order flow to the relays. I would argue the ideal market structure is that the relays provide the order flow to the builders and you commoditize the order flow in that manner at least. That's obviously an intermediate solution. I think like ultimately there's much better solutions, but that's the most broken thing about the market structure today is just the builders bringing their order flow and that becoming the edge that matters most.
I guess, does anyone have like a proposal for like what, what do we see as like a mechanism that like, like you could put something like, Swav or whatever, but we have some centralized source of order flow. It goes here. What is the trade-offs? We're going to look at that. Yeah, you probably have like a different perspective from a different ecosystem, right?
This is like a whole speech. Yeah.
All right, I'll get the 20-second version is cut the order flow out entirely by removing the commit reveal part of PVS, which I don't believe is incentive compatible for validators anyway. When you remove the blind block signing, validators can force, or proposers can force auctions through all of the order flow, and that's going to be value that accrues to them rather than to the builders.
My 20-second solution would be like some kind of relay has like an RPC. They take the order flow from users or from other sources. They just serve it to the builders that are connected to them who like solve. And the builders cannot have like any advantage in bringing their own order flow to the system. This is like intermediate solution.
My 20-second proposal would be, and there's a lot of engineering work that needs to be done to this, but sort of break up the blocks. Like right now, every edge is accretive. If you had multiple lanes, if you had multiple proposers, you could have like one specializing in the sex-text part, one specializing in the, the bundles, one specializing in just sort of raw transfers. You could make that work.
I guess the question is like, why would Consensys and or Uniswap want to give their order flow to the relay for free? And I think there's like this, like, again, like, is this like a path dependency thing? But we're like, like the builder shouldn't be getting the order flow. I think the builders are like buying the order flow. The builders are not the origination of the order flow. And we're seeing some interesting things on like, I think not to like call them out, but like, we like Wintermeat's like working on like Bebop. And you could argue that is like a going up the market and saying, okay, we are a searcher, builder, solver, whatever. We are buying order flow that costs money. Maybe it's actually cheaper if we just go build a competitive front end and then we have that order flow and we get that for free. So I think there's a little bit of like, okay, what about the apps? Like the apps are fundamentally the entities where the majority of the flow is going, and therefore if you say, well, yeah, we think the order flow should go over here, but like, yeah, but how do you actually create a structure where users are going to send the order flow there?
They wouldn't give it to the relays for free. The relay would be a marketplace for block space. So the relay would be the marketplace. The block space would come from the validators. The consumption of the block space would come from the users, and then the market makers on the marketplace are the other builders.
To Malesh's point earlier about the lanes, I don't know if you guys have seen, there's some interesting work that Solana is working on right now with regards to lanes for proposers. But what's interesting is that the way they're dividing up the lanes just means each proposer still has a monopoly over their own lane. And so I think to their point, this is a huge engineering lift. And I think one of the biggest mistakes we can make is underestimating the scale and magnitude of solving such a massive distributed systems problem.
Mm-hmm. No, I mean, don't ask the economists to solve them. Yeah. Distributed
I guess I just go back and like that you get these like gains from just making like marginal improvements.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So it sounds like there's some minority consensus on that order flow relay should be selling order flow or like be the centralized place for order flow to quants, and quants, do these strategies, and they are the most extractive people because they're doing the most work.
They add the most value, yeah.
Yeah. Do you see any solutions in the current space doing something similar to that? You might disagree as well. Go for it.
No, I was just saying, I do not have consensus with that opinion. I think
minority consensus.
Yeah.
2/3, yeah.
Yeah, so do you think there's any solutions, any work in the industry being done right now that, pushes us to that solution? Or do you think we're all still trying to, separate order flow and still want to optimize order flow auctions and whatnot?
I think there's people who kind of like ultimately align with this as being like the long-term vision and are building towards it, yeah.
I mean, I think like, and like this is gonna be like my bias thing, like coming from like another ecosystem like Celestia, but also spending a lot of time in roll-up space, right? We see different structures and like systems where like functionally we have like a combination of this where we have one entity that all the order flow is going to, because you're like, hey, the sequencer, like you want your thing included, you gotta send it to the sequencer, but the sequencer is not reselling that to like a market of quants, or they kind of are, but in like a little bit of an inefficient way. But is there like what do we take away from the fact that we're not seeing like even the centralized sequencer market where we say, okay, all the order flows in one box, it is controlled by like a centralized entity, you could choose to, sell that and run a market on that how you want, and they are choosing to not run that where they say they want to sell it to like quants. What do we take from that? Is that again a path dependent? Is that like an ideological kind of like almost like a social welfare thing, right? Where like there is this kind of narrative that like, oh, you sell it to the quants and the quants are like rugging the users kind of thing.
No,
It's a failure to commoditize the edges, in my opinion. Just like there's too many edges like wrapped in, and you need to separate them before you can have these kinds of market structures that are ideal.
And
It's
I-
like,
yeah. No, I think they've been getting into it, right? Like Time Boost is starting to start thinking about like, and there's like they've also sequencers, like at least L2 sequencers, as I understand them, are already they're taking home a lot of money on L2 gas fees. So they're trying to just get their engineering system working. In some sense, I think the thing is L2s are still growing the pie. There's still more users coming in. Part of the reason for these sort of zero-sum games that we're playing a little right now in Ethereum is mainnet has not grown for a little while. And maybe if mainnet starts growing again, everyone gets back to doing the fun stuff.
I think this is also a really interesting way for the different sequencers and different L2s in general to differentiate themselves from each other. We've talked to a lot of the different teams, and not all of them have the same idea for what to do with, let's say the MEV proceeds. Back to the user who generated it. That's cool, but how do you even know which user is responsible, right? It becomes an attribution problem. Do you give it to the DAO? Do you burn it? Do you use it for retroactive public goods funding? And I think that this is going to be one of the things that we start to see becoming much more of a talking point going forwards, because it is a really clean way that people can intuitively understand for these different L2s to differentiate themselves.
ultimately the user is most important. They're like the most important stakeholder in all of this. It's like, it's all about what delivers them the most value at the end of the day. Even when we're talking about like quants and proposers, right? Like the users can walk away and use a different chain or whatever. So I think like all the thinking about what to do here needs to start with the user. But like you pointed out all the experimentation that's happening on L2s. I think that's like the beautiful thing that's happening at the moment. And the reason I'm so optimistic is we have all of this entropy, we have all of this experimentation. We're not stuck in any kind of inadequate equilibria.
I think you're already right. Like the L2s and like almost the fragmentation of the L2s provides like a market opportunity for like one L2 tries one thing, one L2 tries another thing. It's competitive. Do we see a potential where like, you know, aggregators, and I'll use that term very broadly, whether that's like a search or solve or whatever, reduce a user's kind of like choice in like a pragmatic way, right? Of like, I go to one interface and I want to do a swap, and I don't actually really know what chain that swapped through or what preference, that removes the kind of like user feedback mechanism from them saying, I actually wanted to like prioritize using Optimism because they do rebates in this way, or they, you know, sell order flow this way versus Arbitrum that does time boost.
Well, I think the ideal user experience is chain abstracted. So I think like the user shouldn't even think about these concerns at all.
But does that bring us back to like a similar thing where like, okay, now the chains aren't able to differentiate as easily because there's not a feedback loop with the users knowing which chain they're using. And again, we just have like an intermediary in the path that's saying, I'm abstracting that from the user. User doesn't really care.
Well, I mean, exactly that. Like when you combine these two things, you've got, you know, a chain abstraction user experience where the user doesn't care, but each of these L2s might have their own unique thing that they do with any MEV generated by the order flow. And so the question in my mind that's going to be really, really fun to find out is how are these different, you know, mechanisms, especially from like an attribution standpoint, like who do you give it to, how are they going to interact with the chain abstracted UX?
Okay, I think I can slot in now. So there's a lot of talk about like, hey, L2 sequences is basically like exclusive builders, right? They get all the order flow, and then some of them are doing time boosts, some of them are not. Maybe some of them are just saying, hey, on-chain MEV is me giving back to the quants, right? Just spam the network and go for it. So what role does community and like consensus in the community play into this, right? L2s have this luxury of that they have their own governance, and they can force things through that. What basically, if some person here is starting a new L2, what would you recommend their L2 governance to change the MEV policy do, or how should they view MEV on that L2 as?
What would we define as the community? Like, I guess like a question is like raise your hand if you work at like an L2. So we don't have any L2 developers here. You work at the chain abstraction part.
It's basically an L2.
So
It's basically an L2.
It's like the point is like there's no L2s in the room. It's like, okay, we want like a community discussion.
Users are the most important stakeholder.
Yeah, but like the users are also definitely not in the room. right? Like this is the room where we have like, this is just the MEV room, right?
Yeah.
And like, okay, the users matter, but like there are no users in this room and there are no L2s in this room.
There's no
So
users
there's a
anywhere.
little bit of like a communication problem, right? Of like, how are the users applying feedback? Like they did not fly to Brussels to like have a discussion about MEV.
This gets very philosophical. It's like questions of like how to have effective governance. I mean, blockchains in some sense are like experimentations in governance, just like countries are, right? And like I don't have any easy answers to this question, but transparency is like always something that you should aim towards.
I have a very easy answer to this question, and that's that, you know, a lot of these L2s have their own tokens. And the question is really, are the users of these L2s the same people that own big chunks of these tokens that can vote on issues such as where does the value go to? And especially if we're looking at a chain abstracted user experience where the user doesn't even know what L2 they're on, I find it very unlikely to think that the governance holders, the token holders who are making these decisions, who would benefit from, let's say, the value going to the DAO, are going to vote for users unless you're in a very hyper-competitive environment where you really have to fight for users. And I think that is going to be really fascinating to see. I would love to be that efficient. I'm not sure that we will be, though.
I will say the upside of this, just not to answer the question, is like we over-index on things that we think users care about, and we work backwards from the technological solution we have to here's what a user must be caring about. And one of the fun things about this L2 competition is going to be that maybe we'll uncover what users actually want, and maybe that'll be actually.
Have we
use
tried
cases.
asking them?
Huh?
Have we tried
I
asking them?
believe. I mean, at Consensys, I believe they have. Have I? No, personally.
They like dog coins.
They like fast and cheap usually. They're like willing to trade off privacy and centralization.
Yeah, and again, I think it's that's another thing, right? Like we always over-index on cheap, and I think they often want fast. Like the UX matters a lot more to the average, like to retail, which is what we're trying to get into this system. Not to say that we should be rugging them, but if we are providing like they care about reliability and speed, from what I can tell from talking to like.
One of the interesting things, so we've actually done like a lot of studies on this for our like, you know, app-based like sequencing. And one of the things that we found is that users do care about the fee that they see, which is typically the gas cost. Users have like zero care whatsoever about the price.
Slippage, yeah.
Yep.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and
Like,
this-
they might care if they knew, right? It's like,
this is and this has historically always been true. Like in eBay, users always used to over-index on the shipping cost, and they'll overpay for something as long as it had free shipping attached, which, you know, yeah.
Yeah, so again, it's like the what is exposed to the user and what like feedback are they going to get, right? Like they like speed because speed is very visible. Like the users like Solana. Why? Because they don't have to worry about a gas fee to a degree in which they don't think about a gas fee. And then they like speed and they just like click the hell out of the button until the transaction lands, and they're kind of okay. Yeah, they don't love that, but like they just click the hell out of the button, you know?
Okay, so it sounds like L2 should be like running user surveys, bring users in a room, like stand behind an invisible screen and whatnot.
just generally, we should start with like the user experience and improving that, rather than like what the coolest game theory is, which is like how a lot of development works this day. We like invent a very, we invent a game theoretically sound and like beautiful system, and we like search for like a use case for it. Surely this will solve some kind of problem. Like someone out here must need this, but I think that's like completely the wrong direction. You should start with things that are frustrating actual people, solving those.
One of the like hardest problems, speaking of UX, like one of the hardest problems is quoting, especially if you're doing a cross-chain swap. And just being able to provide a fast quote for something that's cross-chain that involves two separate sequencers is a very, very difficult problem. And it's one where, interestingly enough, there are ways to do it faster if you show a worse price. And so watching to see like what choice, like where along that spectrum of like speed of the quote versus how good the price even is, from the research we've done so far, most people would prefer fast.
Okay, so maybe some closing thoughts. What do you identify as like one key factor that like pushes all of the community towards the market equilibrium that we all desire and dream about all day?
Accelerationism. We should encourage people to break things, to move fast, to force us to deal with these problems early. We should not be like locking these people up and like cooperating with the government to, you know, incarcerate them. We should be fostering a community where people like hackers, people break stuff, people experiment, and like that is actually part of the system. Again, this is like punishing selfishness, and we should be rewarding it.
Anyone else?
I think though a social layer, and I think just like a broadening awareness of the social layer is going to be really interesting. I think that like right now, a lot of people, especially last year, had this opinion that the social layer didn't matter for Ethereum. But as we've seen over the last 12 months, that's anything but the case. And we've seen a lot of scenarios where like if we were to fully accelerate a lot of the MEV right now, it would actually look a lot worse for users than it currently is. And so just having more of a awareness of the social layer and also how to change the social layer, how to disseminate information among the social layer is, I think, going to be really important going forwards.
I think if we want to see kind of like, getting feedback from users, it might be important that like people doing mech design or whatever, like this room gets closer to the users. I think it's actually a positive thing if we see people in this room going towards like running a UI and then saying, okay, I get the metrics on my UI, I see what they're clicking, what is their preference on the slippage. Hey, I have a drop down, I A/B tested, it's default slippage 2%, I drop it to 1.5%. Do I see notably higher volume? That's actually a good thing. One of the like specific limiting factors, and maybe this is just like a personal bugbear, is from like being a US based like entity, the actual like legal limitation that like your legal counsel will tell you is like, look, you can go deploy your like DEX contract on chain. They don't care about that. Don't run the front end. The government doesn't like running the front end. So we actually have, to Nathan's point, like don't cooperate with the government, but we do have like, you have to take some risk if you want to run the front end. And so I think there's like a potential risk of saying, what if that settles in some space where there is like a regulatory burden to doing that, and there's like an explicit kind of like legal mandate that says you have to stay far away, and there's only a small number of like blessed entities or regulatorily offshore entities or whatever they're able to do that. But I do think like people need to kind of take that risk if they want to get that information. They have to get it from the source, not get it from a middleman.
So accelerationism at risk prison.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, it's like if, at some point if you want to be like accelerationist, like someone's going to tell you to slow down, and you have to decide like, no, I'm going to keep going, and we'll see if this bites me in the ass later. But like I'm not going to worry about that right now.
30 years in a federal jail.
Well, we'll see. I don't think they're going to give the Uniswap Labs guys 30 years in federal jail, but like, that's not legal advice.
Okay, so run front ends, don't be scared of the government. That's the end of the talk, I think. Next year, Kubi will bring flying in some users as well, so we can get some actual feedback. Thank you.